Next of Kin, author ApollinaV, pairing Hermione Granger and Severus Snape. Rating T. Read to you by Flung from Orbit. Dedication to Mischievous T entirely. This is absolutely her story and plotline. Chapter 1. Relations. "Excuse me?" Hermione said, godsmacked. "You're listed as his next of kin, ma'am," the ministry stooge behind the glass window dully repeated. Hermione's fist squeezed around the crumpled ministry summons, her weekend plans revolving around bowls of cereal, her favorite pajamas, a trashy romance novel, and catching up on some research for work. Receiving the news that her presence was required at the Ministry of Justice, there was a lark, and at 7:30 no less, had been quite unwelcome. Learning she was there on Severus Snape's behalf was just the cherry on top. "I'm the next of kin?" The news sank like a stone. "That's what the paperwork here says," the apathetic administrator noted, holding up a rather thick file. It might have been earth-shattering news to Hermione. Before the filing clerk, his eyes darted to the rather long line forming behind her. He just needed to move her along. Azkaban Prison was cleaning house. 60-odd inmates were scheduled to be released. "Sign here." Paperwork was pushed in front of her. "There must be a mistake," Hermione noted. "I'm not related to him." It's not that she really had much against the mangled war hero. She testified on his behalf once. He'd also been a competent professor and decent enough conversationalist on the rare occasion when he deemed her worthy enough to speak to. But a fan of Snape? No, she couldn't claim that title. Hermione didn't hero worship him like Harry, and on the whole she felt rather ambivalent towards his plight. He'd been acquitted of murder and a whole slew of rather serious charges, but convicted of a lesser crime, failing to register his ability to fly, a charge similar to failing to register as an animagi. While most people were able to talk their way out of a misdemeanor, especially if they greased the right palms, the defense, "Voldemort wouldn't let me," just didn't strike the right note with the Wizengamot. And well, that was justice served. "There's no way I can be his next of kin." Hermione pushed the paper back to the clerk, refusing to sign. "Look, miss, just sign them." The room was filling with impatient families. He knew from experience that the longer it took to process a release, the greater the odds increased that babies would start crying. If there's no one here to sign for him, he can't be released. But Azkaban can't hold prisoners forever. You want we should petition him to be euthanized? Hermione's eyes widened in horror. It worked every time. She hastily scribbled her name on the release form and shuffled off to the next waiting room. The plain room was filled with uncomfortable chairs and arranged in efficient rows. She found a seat and scanned the small gathering there. Some children played with toy wands while nervous-looking young mothers tried to keep them quiet. An older woman with silver hair that matched the shade of yarn she was knitting seemed perfectly calm, except for the slight tremble in her lips. Hermione wondered how long she had been waiting for the release of a loved one. Two men, presumably brothers, sat tense and very much on edge. Hermione thought they bore close enough resemblance to Gregory Goyle to be family. And there she was, fearfully indifferent to her prisoner, waiting impatiently for a man she barely knew and had no desire to be reunited with. How the hell was she the next of kin for Severus Snape? Hermione racked her mind for what little personal information she knew about the man. He was a half-blood. Was it possible that she shared a blood relation on the Muggle side? Would that possibly explain why she manifested magic? A recessive gene? No, that didn't even make sense. Aside from which, he was a northerner. Hermione didn't have family in the north. She had a great uncle who once sought his fortune up there. Was it possible they had a distant relation in common? Unconsciously, Hermione shook her head. 2 hours later, the room was filled with more eager and emotional families. They whispered among themselves and traded stories of happier times. Some checked their timepieces, anticipating the moment of reunion. Hermione looked at her watch, wondering how much more of her weekend she had to sacrifice and laminate her decision not to bring her book with her. But then she was told she only had to be there to sign a few papers. Trust the ministry to make signing papers an all-day affair. The furthest door opened and several people sat up. Hermione could hear clamor and clanking sounds coming from an echoing hallway. "Clear the way!" an aura boomed. He led a small procession of emaciated prisoners linked together in chains, and a wail went up from several women. At the first line of prisoners moved through, some people packed up and followed them out the door. "Clear the way!" Another roar shouted as another line of prisoners appeared in the doorway. Hermione made a mew of disgust. On the rare occasion that she had reason to visit the fetid prison, the conditions appalled her. Cells were tiny and prisoners were packed in. Though Hermione thought their body heat probably created more warmth than the insufficient rags they wore, the prison reeked of fish and seawater, and as the second line of haggard prisoners clanked and lumbered past her, Hermione's nostrils were filled with the revolting stench. Personally, she thought that it was an outrage that Azkaban still existed. It was a scandalous throwback to the appalling institution of the Industrial Revolution, and had no place in modern society. But then it was just another example in which the wizarding world was backwards and antiquated. Another Aurora marched in a line of shackled inmates. To Hermione's relief, they appeared better fed and seemed to manage basic grooming. The vacant, faraway look was still in their eyes, but Hermione held out hope that with some coaxing they might manage to adjust. Line after line of inmates paraded past and receiving family members dwindled. The conditions of the prisoners improved. It seemed as if the first to be released were the worst of the lot, possibly those who'd been incarcerated the longest. Snape had only been in prison for 6 years. In wizarding terms, that was hardly any time at all. A minor inconvenience to people who lived well past a century. Hermione glanced at her watch as her stomach rumbled. Beneath her breath, she cursed him for not being in one of the first groups. Mentally, she recounted that she had just needed to escort him out of the building and then she could be on her way. "Clear the way!" another Aurora shouted. Despite the fact that most of the waiting room was empty, Hermione watched with keen interest the slumped shoulders and haggard heads of inmates that shuffled into the room, her eyes on the lookout for a man she might recognize as Snape. Of course, he was the very last prisoner. How like Snape to make an entrance. Recognizing him was not a problem. Every prisoner looked beaten in spirit and body, with unfocused eyes and hobbled gait. Not Severus Snape. Other than being dressed in drab gray, Hermione didn't think he appeared any different from when she'd seen him last. The jagged pink scar on his neck was the only bit of color on his black and white person. He wasn't dragging his body of bones about him like the rest of the men. Tall, angular, and fierce, Severus Snape projected an unbroken spirit, and walked in precisely measured steps. His gait halted only by the length of chain wrapped around his ankle. Hermione's eyes were drawn to his knuckles. They protruded against the taut skin as if he were ready, at any moment, to strike. Immediately, she decided, she was going to escort him out to Diagon Alley, wish him well, and apparate away. She had more important worries than Severus Snape.